All right. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon. I guess you could be watching this in the afternoon. But I'm sorry that we can't take our notes by Zoom today, but instead we're going to do it this way. So I will talk to you some about bureaucracy. The skeletal outline is available for you on Schoology if you like to take your notes virtually. If you'd rather take them by pen and paper, of course, that's fine with me. Either way, as I'm talking, if you come up with questions that I don't answer, make sure you make a little note of them and you ask me when we're together again on Tuesday. So let's go ahead and get started talking about the federal bureaucracy. Just a quick introduction. Bureaucracy is, for our purposes, we're going to be talking about the federal government bureaucracy, which means we're talking about the millions of unelected federal government workers who help enforce the law. The millions of unelected federal government workers who help enforce the law. So like I said, there's all kinds of people working for the federal government. Many live and work in DC or Northern Virginia, but there's federal government offices and land all over the country. And the unelected people who work in those places are bureaucrats. They work for the federal bureaucracy. But there's more than just the federal government bureaucracy. Any state or local government has its own bureaucracy. In fact, any sufficiently large enough organization that is sophisticated or complex enough is going to have some form of bureaucracy. So you can find bureaucracies in state governments, local governments, large corporations. If you've ever found yourself on hold with customer service, for some large corporation, you have experienced that company's bureaucracy. Or religious organizations that are large enough might have bureaucracy, or civic organizations. So you can find bureaucracy in any large enough, sophisticated enough organization. Now, when we say that federal bureaucrats serve multiple masters, let me clarify what that means. Of course, the president leads the bureaucracy. He sets policy goals for the federal bureaucracy, and they basically have to follow along with the direction that he sets for them. But bureaucrats are also loyal to their institution. FBI agents are loyal to the FBI as an institution and their direct supervisors. People who work for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, same thing. So federal bureaucrats don't just serve the president. They also feel a sense of institutional loyalty to the agency that they serve. And bureaucrats also serve Congress. Congress sets the budget for federal bureaucrats. So the bureaucracy feels a need to keep Congress happy. And if there's some kind of scandal or something goes wrong, Congress can call those bureaucrats to testify. And no bureaucrat wants that. That's very uncomfortable, very unpleasant. So they're going to try to keep Congress happy too. So bureaucrats serve the president, they serve their institution, and they also serve Congress, who sets their budget and can exercise oversight, meaning they can testify, they can call the bureaucrats to testify if something goes wrong. Bureaucrats are much more pluralist than majoritarian. Remember, majoritarian democracy is this idea that whatever a majority of Americans want, that's what we should do. But pluralist democracy is a little bit more complicated. It's this idea that there might be smaller groups, sort of like the factions of Federalist 10, and bureaucrats kind of fall into that world where they may do things that are unpopular, but bureaucrats are unelected. They're pretty unaccountable directly to voters. They're able to make policy changes without ever really having to face the voters. So they're more pluralist than they would be majoritarian. And like I said, the purpose of the federal bureaucracy is to enforce the law and ensure that businesses, organizations, and people are compliant with the law. If the law says it has to be this way, then it's the federal bureaucracy's job to make sure that businesses and people are compliant. All right, one of the big themes of this whole chapter is how the federal bureaucracy has expanded over time. We're going to talk about this idea of cooperative federalism, meaning the federal government and the federal bureaucracy has expanded over time. Remember back to our federalism chapter where we talked about the difference between cooperative federalism and dual federalism. In dual federalism, you've got the national government and the state government, and they never really interact. There should not be a lot of overlap. We call that layer cake federalism. But cooperative federalism, you've got the national government kind of seeping into what had been state issues and taking a much more active role in people's daily lives. And we're going to look at how that has happened over time. A big part of that has been demands by citizens. People have asked the federal government to step in and get more involved. This has happened in a few ways just in the past 100 years. The federal government used to not get too involved in economic recessions or depressions. They were much more laissez-faire, much more hands-off. They weren't going to step in and take a direct role in people's daily economic lives. That changes, of course, with the Great Depression, when the federal government expands the federal bureaucracy in a huge way. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal program, which we'll talk about later, creates all kinds of new federal government programs designed specifically for economic recovery. So citizens start demanding that the federal government take on a bigger role in their lives. Same with disaster relief. When there was a big natural disaster, the federal government used to step back and let state and local governments and charitable organizations handle it. But increasingly, citizens have said, look, there is no other institution in the country that has the logistical support and has the budget of the federal government and the resources of the federal government. So the citizens began demanding that the federal government take on a more active role. The second point here, interest groups, PACs, lobbyists. Of course, interest groups are going to push government in a particular direction. PACs, by the way, stands for Political Action Committees. They raise money for interest groups, and these interest groups try to push government to adopt a certain policy, and that policy has to be enforced by the bureaucracy. Same thing happens with the media. Media can draw attention to a particular issue and force a response from the government. That response requires enforcement by the bureaucracy. Let me give you an example. You may have heard of the television show Last Week Tonight. It's on HBO. It's hosted by a guy named John Oliver. He did a segment where he was pointing out inconsistencies with the IRS. He was showing that religious organizations, which are tax exempt, meaning they don't pay taxes, he showed that it's incredibly easy to start one of those organizations and not pay taxes on the money you bring in. And he basically shamed the IRS into changing their policy and cracking down on some of these organizations that were not paying taxes. So just by drawing attention to it, John Oliver in the media was able to show that this policy needed to change. And then the last thing here, pork barrel legislation. We haven't talked about that yet. We'll talk about it in greater detail in our legislative branch chapter. But pork barrel legislation is what happens when a member of Congress adds something to a bill that's only going to benefit that member's voters. Let me give you a hypothetical example. Suppose our member of the House of Representatives, Elaine Luria, was able to add something to a bill that would use federal government money to build another bridge tunnel in Hampton Roads. We've got the HRBT, we've got the Monitor Merrimack. Suppose she was able to get the federal government to build us a third bridge tunnel out of Virginia Beach. If she were able to do that, it would really only benefit her constituents, the people who live here, but it would be using federal tax money from all over the country. That's pork barrel legislation. It's really only benefiting her constituents, even though it's using federal government dollars. And again, we call that pork barrel legislation because that new project has to get built. Bureaucrats have to get involved. The federal government says we must spend money on this, and that's going to add to the federal bureaucracy. It's going to increase their role in people's daily lives. So we'll talk about another few ways that the federal government bureaucracy has expanded. Of course, with McCulloch versus Maryland, the federal government itself took on a much larger role. Think back to McCulloch versus Maryland with the necessary and proper clause. The Supreme Court said the necessary and proper clause gives Congress really broad, really vague, unchecked, undefined powers to do what they think is necessary and proper. That's the basis for implied powers, that Congress can do more than just what the Constitution says. McCulloch versus Maryland was like a green light for Congress to get more involved in people's daily lives. The same thing is true of Gibbons versus Ogden, which is another case we've talked about before. It used the Commerce Clause. It did kind of the same thing with the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. It gave Congress very broad, very unchecked powers to get more involved in interstate commerce. Remember, trade between states. Congress has really broad power over that. So the federal government can get more involved in states' issues and in people's daily lives. The 14th Amendment, we've talked about before, we're going to talk about a lot more. But the 14th Amendment contains what's called the Equal Protection Clause. The Equal Protection Clause. It just says everyone has to be treated equally under the law. This makes the federal government responsible for guaranteeing civil rights. That means if you've got a civil rights issue, you're able to take it to the federal government and get them involved. And so that creates a much larger role for the federal government as far as guaranteeing people's rights. So the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment gives the federal government this huge role in the issue of civil rights. We're going to talk a little bit about the Roosevelt boys. Teddy Roosevelt first with the progressives. Teddy gets the federal government involved economically. He starts breaking up some of the major monopolies. So he brings the power of the federal government into the economy, starts busting up some of the big monopolies. He gets progressives in the media to help him find big social problems that he can help solve. So, for example, this is around the time that Upton Sinclair is writing The Jungle and bringing attention to the fact that the meatpacking industry is really gross. And it's not just beef in the beef, it's also like rat and human fingers, all kinds of nasty stuff. So this leads directly to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, right? That's a federal bureaucratic agency who's responsible for making sure that the food is food. So that's why you can trust when you go out to eat and you order chicken that it's actually chicken. You can trace that assurance back to this time period where you've got a president like Teddy Roosevelt and this progressive era saying, hey, maybe it's the government's job to make sure that businesses aren't taking advantage of people. Even as recently as I think the 1980s or 90s, the FDA got in a huge fight with peanut butter because companies that made peanut butter, their product was only about 75% peanut butter and the rest was like filler and water. And so the FDA said, look, you got to bring it up. You got to bring it up into the 90s. That dates back, that's the FDA, dating back to their original purpose. Again, making sure food is what they say it is, monitoring businesses to make sure that consumers aren't being taken advantage of. And of course, like I mentioned before, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal, federal government gets hugely involved in people's economic lives. Franklin Roosevelt creates all these big federal government programs designed to get the federal government involved in the economy. We've talked about the CCC before, the Civilian Conservation Corps. All kinds of land, federal parks were created by and maintained by the CCC. So you would get a bunch of 18-year-olds, you would have them digging ditches and digging out hiking trails and stuff like that. You would pay them for it. You would tell them that they had to send most of the money back home to their family, and that was a way of getting money into the economy. The Tennessee Valley Authority went into some of the poorest, most rural parts of the Tennessee Valley to try to get them basics like electricity. And again, that's the federal government taking on this big economic responsibility. The biggest thing to come out of the New Deal, the one thing to most associate with it, is Social Security. We talked about that with federalism, but Social Security is a massive government spending project, one of the biggest things the federal government spends money on, which means it takes a huge bureaucracy to make sure it runs well. So people have to be there to keep that whole system operating. You got to have lots of bureaucrats in a large organization to manage it. We've talked about LBJ before in the Great Society. We talked about that in our federalism. Most of this actually is kind of a callback to our federalism chapter. So just a reminder, LBJ and the Great Society, we get Medicare and Medicaid out of that. Medicare and Medicaid. Remember, Medicare is government-provided healthcare for people 65 and older. Medicaid is government-provided healthcare for people who are low income or have disabilities. And so Medicare and Medicaid are, again, these government programs designed to provide healthcare for people who otherwise might not have access to it. Those are two more huge federal government programs, and running them well requires a lot of people and a lot of government spending. So between Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, that is a huge portion of the federal government budget. We mentioned George W. Bush in our federalism chapter, No Child Left Behind. That's getting the federal government involved in education. The Affordable Care Act, again, expanding federal government's role in healthcare. So giving states the option to expand Medicaid, making that program bigger. Creating exchanges where people who otherwise don't have access to health insurance can buy health insurance from the state government or the federal government, and requiring that people buy health insurance. The individual mandate requiring that people buy health insurance is another expansion of federal government bureaucracy. At the end of the day, and this kind of summarizes everything we just talked about, we are living in a way more complex society than the people who wrote the Constitution could have imagined. So the framers would not have imagined the need for this massive federal government bureaucracy. But because society is so much more advanced and so complex, bureaucracy helps keep things running smoothly. I know it doesn't feel like it when you're interacting with bureaucracy, but that's kind of their purpose, to keep up with the complexity of society. All right, let's talk about a few more things, at least for this first video here. Let's talk about some negatives with the pathology. Let's talk about some negatives with bureaucracy. So we call these pathologies, negative connotations associated with bureaucracy. So the first one, when you talk about bureaucracy, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about red tape. Red tape is a term for seemingly unnecessary steps to accomplish a relatively simple task. Seemingly unnecessary steps to accomplish a relatively simple task. That's what we mean by red tape. That term usually refers to lots of unnecessary paperwork. So if you've got lots of extra steps or lots of extra paperwork, you'll hear people talk about red tape. Duplication or triplication, this is where you have multiple agencies doing the same thing, multiple agencies doing the same job, or multiple people within an agency who all seem to have the same job. One big criticism of bureaucracy is that it is ever expanding, that you maybe have 10 people doing a job that could be done by 3 people. So this idea of duplication or triplication, that you have more agencies than you need, or that you have more people in those agencies than you need. To give you an example, I think the United States, last I checked, has something like 17 different intelligence gathering agencies. And they don't all always talk to each other or get along, which is not always great. Bureaucracy is associated with long lines. If you've ever hung out at the Department of Motor Vehicles, that's a state bureaucratic institution, but you've experienced probably some long lines there. Bureaucracy feels wasteful, going back to having lots of different agencies or too many people in the job. If we could cut down the number of people, we could cut down the size of government, which means we could cut taxes. That's another big criticism of bureaucracy, is that there's too many tax dollars going to pay salaries for too many federal government workers. Imperialism is a term for the fact that we really kind of are at the mercy of government bureaucrats. So oftentimes something that's very important in our lives comes down to a decision made by an unelected government bureaucrat. I'll give you another example of this, and it happens to involve John Oliver, the same guy from Last Week Tonight. He used to work on The Daily Show, And he's British, and he was working in the United States. So every once in a while, he would have to go back to Great Britain and visit the American embassy and get permission to work in the United States for another period of time. And so at one point, he told a story about going back to the US Embassy in London. He was asking for permission to work in the United States again. This was during George W. Bush's administration. He got up to the front of the line, got to the person working in the embassy, told her who he was, told her what he was doing. And she looked at all his paperwork and she said, "You know, I've seen you on The Daily Show, and I've seen you make fun of our country's president. And I'm not sure that I should let you go back to work in the United States if you're just going to go to our country and make fun of the president." And he said he could feel his face turn white, and he kind of started to stutter a response. And then she said, "No, I'm just kidding. You're fine." And then she stamped his paper and sent him on his way. But he felt, again, completely at her mercy. Sometimes these unelected bureaucrats seem to hold a great deal of power over us. And we're going to come back to this idea. I'll touch on it briefly here, but the idea that bureaucracy sometimes seems to violate the separation of powers. Remember, separation of powers is this idea that we have one branch of government who makes policy, one branch that enforces policy, and one branch that interprets policy or handles disputes. But sometimes bureaucracy seems to do all three. So we're going to talk later on about a power that bureaucracies have where they can make policy without Congress. They are the institution responsible for enforcing it. That's their job. And then they handle complaints without the courts at times. And we'll get into all of that in a little bit, but it seems like bureaucracy sometimes violates the separation of powers. All right, let's do a little bit more today. So we'll talk some about the past and how we got the bureaucracy that we have today. So originally, you did not have to have any qualifications to get appointed or get hired in a federal government job. You really just had to be connected with the president or his political party. This was called the spoils system, or also called patronage, meaning every time a new president took office, the entire federal bureaucracy was at risk of being fired so that that president could put his friends and supporters into cushy federal jobs. Didn't matter that they weren't qualified, didn't matter that they didn't have any experience, or maybe didn't even care about what position they were being put into. The president would just put friends and political allies into these positions. And again, this is called the spoil system or patronage. We most associate it with Andrew Jackson. But then we start seeing the professionalization of the bureaucracy. Professionalization. Here's what I mean by that. We had a president, James Garfield, who was assassinated by someone who thought Garfield should have given him a bureaucratic job. Again, the assassin thought that Garfield owed him a job. He wrote Garfield repeatedly demanding a job, and when he didn't get one, he shot the president, which is definitely an overreaction. Shot and killed Garfield. And after that, in order to deal with this crisis, the president who came after Garfield, Chester A. Arthur, put into place the Pendleton Act. The Pendleton Act. So the Pendleton Act professionalizes the bureaucracy. It says, look, when a new president comes in, he can replace the people at the top, the directors of these various agencies. But everyone else should get their job because they're qualified for it, because they have experience, education, and expertise in the field. The Pendleton Act establishes the Civil Service Commission, which is the federal government commission responsible for making sure that bureaucratic employees get their jobs because they're qualified for it, not because they are owed some political favor. We call this the merit system. That's different from the spoils system. So the merit system, different from the spoils system. We're professionalizing the bureaucracy. That means you can work in the federal government now. You could work at the same agency for 30 years, retire, get a sweet federal government pension, And if you're a Democrat, you can work in that same agency under Democratic presidents and under Republican presidents. Same thing if you're a Republican, you can work in that same agency under Democratic presidents and Republican presidents. Your political affiliation no longer matters. What matters is that you're good at your job, that you have expertise, that you're qualified. This is called the merit system. You get the job because you earned it. You get a promotion because you earned it. You will sometimes hear about ways around this system. You'll hear it called the buddy system, that people will still find ways to promote or hire friends and political allies, but it's definitely much more rare than it was under the spoils system. But again, in the modern era, we call it the buddy system, when you know someone who can get you a sweet federal government job. We also have a law in place called the Hatch Act, which is designed to prevent federal government employees from using their position to do political campaigning. Okay, so we want a federal government employee not to be able to use their job to do political campaigning. So let's say you worked for the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It would be a violation of the Hatch Act for you to go inspect some place of business to make sure they're compliant with environmental law and tell them that you're not going to pass them in their inspection unless they promise to vote for a certain candidate or donate money to a certain candidate, right? That's not good. That would violate the Hatch Act. You can't use your job to engage in political campaigning. Now, once you're no longer on the clock, once you're not at work anymore, you can go home and campaign to your heart's content. You just can't use your position in order to politically campaign. There are similar rules. It's not the Hatch Act that applies to federal government workers, but there are similar rules in place for teachers, right? I can't use my position to engage in political campaigning, but once I'm on my free time, once I'm no longer working, then I can and have and do frequently engage in political activities. So you just have to separate your personal life and your professional life. Okay, let's see what's coming next. All right, let's talk about a few components of the bureaucracy. First thing, the employees of the federal bureaucracy, the federal government workers, we call them bureaucrats or civil servants. Bureaucrats or civil servants. So let's talk about some examples. First, you've got the cabinet level positions at the top. So this is Department of, right? Department of State, Department of Justice, Department of Education, Department of Housing and Urban Development. The cabinet departments are led by the cabinet secretaries. You can tell a member of the cabinet because all of their titles start with the phrase Secretary of. So this is Secretary of Education, or Secretary of State, or Secretary of Defense. There's one exception to that rule. The person who leads the Department of Justice is not called the Secretary of Justice. They're called the Attorney General. But otherwise, all the other cabinet secretaries are Secretary of whatever. And in order to get a cabinet position, you have to be nominated by the president and approved by a majority vote in the Senate. So that's half the Senate plus one, 51 votes. Within each cabinet department are bureaus. So smaller organizations, smaller parts of the federal bureaucracy exist within the cabinet. So you've got the Department of Justice as this large organization. Within the Department of Justice, you've got the FBI, right, and the DEA and the ATF, all these various organizations that exist as component parts of the Department of Justice. So each federal department breaks down into these smaller bureaus. Keep in mind, we talked about this with the executive branch, that cabinet secretaries don't do as much of that day-to-day advising of the president as the White House staff. The cabinet secretaries have their own departments that they need to manage their day-to-day activities. They can't be meeting with the president on a daily basis. So it's the White House staff, really, these people who are hired directly by the president and don't have Senate approval. Those are the ones really giving the president his day-to-day advice. And of course, as presidents change, what each cabinet department is doing is going to change, and the direction in which they go is going to change. There was quite a shift from President Obama to President Trump in many of the cabinet departments. If Joe Biden were to win in November, there would be quite a shift in another direction. So if you're one of these bureaucrats, one of these civil services working in one of these departments, every 4 or 8 years, you might get a little bit of whiplash from having different presidents and different administrations come in, because each president is going to have their own policy goals and priorities. Independent or executive agencies are, these are agencies that are given a specific goal. They're given the funding to meet it, and then they're basically set loose. So independent or executive agencies, they don't have oversight powers. They don't make policy. They are given a goal and they are told to go meet it. So an example for an independent agency would be like NASA. A president might say, hey, NASA, your job is to work on building us a colony on Mars. Congress is going to give you some money. Build us a Martian colony. NASA is an independent agency. They're not making policy. They're just given a goal and they're given the resources to meet it. The National Institute of Health might be another example of an independent or executive agencies. They're given funding and they're told to conduct health research. A regulatory commission, these are the controversial ones. Regulatory commissions are parts of the federal government bureaucracy that have authoritative discretion to make regulations. Let me say that again. Regulatory commissions are part of the federal government that have authoritative discretion to make regulations. This term, authoritative discretion, this is a big deal with bureaucracy. Authoritative means power, right? And discretion means like, it's up to you, right? You kind of have, you have options, you have a choice. So regulatory commissions have this freedom to make rules that have the force of law. Regulatory commissions have the freedom to make rules that have the force of law. How does that work, right? I thought Congress made the laws. It works because when Congress creates these regulatory commissions, they give them the power to make these rules. So Congress might make the FCC, right? That's an example of a regulatory commission, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission. And when they made the FCC, they said, this commission has the authority, the authoritative discretion to make regulations related to broadcast communications. Right? The FCC, the Federal Communication Commissions, when they're made by Congress, they're given the authority to make regulations regarding broadcasts. So at first that's just radio, then it becomes television. FCC has dipped into internet as well. So the FCC, because of the power invested in the FCC by Congress, they have the power to make these rules, to make these regulations that therefore have the force of law. Now, if Congress doesn't like the rule that the FCC makes, they can override it with a law. These regulations have to exist, kind of like executive orders. They have to exist within the law. So Congress can certainly override it. But frequently, Congress does not have the time, nor do they have the expertise, nor do they want to touch something that is politically controversial. So these regulatory commissions, this is their whole job. So they've got the time. They are chosen because of their expertise, the people who work there, and they're not accountable to voters. So they don't mind touching things that are politically controversial. So Congress will sometimes give authoritative discretion to these commissions like the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which deals with stocks and bonds, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that would be another example of a regulatory commission. They can make regulations within the law that have to be followed, particularly by businesses. That's where these regulatory commissions really come into contact with some controversies, when they put regulations in place that businesses have to follow. Like if the EPA put regulations in place on car emissions, right? That would be an example of the EPA exercising its authoritative discretion, making rules that Congress didn't make, but Congress empowered the EPA to make those rules. They gave them authoritative discretion, or sometimes you'll see it called discretionary authority. The heads of these organizations, usually they're called directors or chairs, and they are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. Lastly, you've got government corporations, a business run by the federal government. A business run by the federal government. That's a government corporation. Two big examples, one that's been in the news a lot recently. One is the U.S. Postal Service. They are run by the federal government. The U.S. Postal Service does not make a profit, but that was never their job. They take on the responsibility for providing a service that might otherwise be unprofitable. It's necessary but unprofitable. Or it would be way too confusing if there were too many competitors. So we want to be sure that we put something in the mail and it doesn't matter. We don't have to worry about, I mail with this company, you mail with that company. If I send it to you, are you definitely going to get it? We don't have to mess with that. We know if we put it in the mail, it's handled by the U.S. Postal Service. So that's why that's a government corporation. They are there to provide this necessary service. Amtrak, passenger trains, it's another example of a government corporation. They are not profitable, haven't been for a long time, but federal government still views them as necessary. Therefore, they continue to support Amtrak to make sure that the passenger trains continue to function. So that seems like a good stopping point for our first video. Hopefully there will be a second one. Again, if you've got questions, definitely let me know. And hopefully this works pretty smoothly.